Hello, everybody, and welcome to what is now called Sequence Break. Today, I am really excited and joined by the one, the only Mr. EvanGrill. Evan is one of the first people I ever met when I started out on this journey of speedrunning, and he's incredibly knowledgeable and has helped me mod a bunch of my consoles. And he's going to join us today. Hey, Evan, how's it going?
It's going well.
Thanks for being here. First, why don't you tell us a little bit? When did you start playing video games? How did you? What was like the first experience with it?
So the first video games I remember playing were at my friend Frank's house, and he had a Nintendo, a NES, looked just like the toaster model that you have there. Um, and then when shortly thereafter, I was like, I want video games, and my dad, in his infinite wisdom, decided the more expensive the better. So instead of buying me an NES, he bought me a TurboGrafx 16.
Oh my god! What the hell
Uh,
possessed him to do that?
I don't know. I think at the time he saw the like demos and said, "Well, this one looks better. The graphics are there's more colors on the screen and the graphics are better. This is the one I'm going to get." We also had a $2,500 computer in the mid
Ooh,
'80s, which is kind of crazy when everyone else had $600 Commodore 64s.
no kidding. What was your first game you had on the TurboGrafx 16?
Well, the packing game was Keith Courage, and then I want to say it was either Bonk's Revenge or um, King of Casino, because my dad liked casino games.
Sounds fair. And then, do you remember like
Yeah.
what did you? Were there any games that like while you were playing with your friend on your Nintendo that kind of sparked the itch or the bug?
We used to play. So we used to play the Super Mario Brothers games, but the one I remember really distinctively playing with Frank was TNC Surf Factory
Oh yeah, good music.
or TNC Surf Designs.
Yeah.
But yeah. And then when then from there, my grandmother at a garage sale found an Atari 2600 with about 50 games, and she also found a Commodore VIC 20, and that Commodore VIC 20 actually, I don't know if it had a bad game port. Looking back on it now, maybe I didn't understand how to load games because it wasn't just plug and start the thing up.
No, you had to type a command in there
But
to start the thing.
yeah, but because I didn't know how to start games, the games that came with it were meaningless to me. But I ended up starting to program.
Oh, very cool.
That was the first time I programmed anything, and a lot of it was copy and paste out of the old magazines and stuff. But I did learn to modify things, and it would change the graphics a little bit and stuff like that. And now I have a degree in computer science and engineering.
That's so awesome. I remember you had, if I remember correctly, it's a very basic version of Basic on the VIC 20, where you had to use
Yeah,
line numbers and the whole thing, right?
yeah, it's my understanding is it's licensed from Microsoft because
Oh,
Microsoft was the license holder for Basic, and so it was licensed from Microsoft. So for the most part, it was a standard Basic. It just had its own commands for interfacing with like the memory and stuff like that.
I, VIC 20 is one of the few consoles. We actually have our childhood VIC 20, and I should try to figure out a way to stream that at some point because I'm pretty sure it was RF going out of there and everything. I don't think it even had composite or anything like that.
I believe it does actually have composite. The 64 has S video, but I believe you can get composite out of the VIC 20.
Oh man, that'd be
If
great.
not, there's definitely mods for it.
Awesome. So you mentioned when you kind of got the itch to also start changing things and modifying things and all that kind of stuff. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of the things you can actually do to a Nintendo later on. But when did you start actually trying to? When did you get into hardware and soldering and all those kind of things?
So I took when I was in college, I took a course. The entry level engineering course requires that uh, like all engineers have to take it, and
Hmm.
it's basically how to work in a team. Pardon me, just a second.
Yeah, no problem.
Um, and what we had to build was we had to build a hovercraft that would follow a black line on a white surface. And
That's the intro class.
Yeah, that's the control class. Now
Jeez.
we didn't have to design the controllers and stuff like that. That was all using the Lego robotics kits.
Cool.
But I had to be able to. It was not sufficient to turn on the hovercraft fans and just let it go. I needed to be able to have the controller turn the left and right turning fans on and stuff like that. So I bought a little Fire Stick soldering iron. If you don't know what Fire Stick is, it's the like joke term for the soldering iron that just plugs directly into the wall.
Oh, nice. Okay. I was like, I didn't know what you're talking about.
Start a fire.
Yeah.
Um, I bought one of those at Radio Shack, and I bought a little prototype board, and I just was like, I can figure out this soldering thing. And I soldered for probably 2 hours without any sort of fan, just inhaling fumes, and I got a headache. But it worked. The only part that didn't work was I bought a potentiometer to control the power of the lift fans, and those lift fans were way more powerful than that potentiometer can handle.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so as soon as we turned it on, it started smoking.
Oh wow. Just like out of a movie.
Yeah. So we had to change up our plan. But yeah, we ended up getting a good grade on that project. And I started watching videos on YouTube at that point that had soldering in it. But it wasn't until maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago that I really got a good soldering iron and learned to do a lot more of the advanced soldering techniques. I learned the value of flux and all the other good soldering techniques.
Well, that's pretty cool. What a great way to start. Do you have any like inspirations early on from YouTube that maybe you'd be willing to share? We could talk about it in the resource part, but is there anybody early on that kind of, hey, that looks like something I should try?
There's a YouTuber named Great Scott. He does a huge amount of videos on building your own things with electronics. He's German. Voltar, we'll probably mention him like 8 more times this episode, but his stuff didn't start coming around until after I had started doing a little bit of my own soldering, but I definitely learned some better ways to do things watching him. And then there's a lot of good and bad examples out there. Don't watch don't watch people do soldering for cars.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
You can get a decent idea of how to match two stranded wires together and stuff like that. But they're not doing typically electronics. They're doing just getting two wires to connect together.
Okay.
And they're not usually using fine tools to do it. They're using a big giant soldering gun.
They're not having to get on a circuit board, that has a target that's about millimeters. So, okay, very cool. So that's a really great intro and kind of some background on where you're approaching and where you're coming from for this. Let's talk. So the idea for this episode and why we're starting with the NES was the first game that I ever speedrun was Super Mario Brothers 3, and there's kind of not a bunch, but there were a few steps that I had to take to kind of figure out how, first of all, could I submit a run? How do I record a run? But more importantly, let's start with how will my Nintendo that I have right now that I just bought, from a retro store or at a garage sale or wherever I got my Nintendo, how do I get it on the TV? So let's start with the basics of the basics. If I just wanted to play my Nintendo on a modern TV, we'll start with modern TV. What is the easiest, what are some of the non-destructive, I shouldn't say destructive, but non-actual internal modifications that I have to do to get this thing on the TV? And can I just plug it right in?
It depends on which model you got.
Okay.
If you got the top loader versus this toaster model, the top loader in America only outputs RF. And so if you have a modern TV, so RF is the old, the screw-in cable jack. If you have a modern TV, it's possible that's not an option for you anymore. But it might work. That should work to get it onto the TV. Now, if you have this toaster model, on the side of it, it actually has a composite video and a single mono composite audio out. on the side of it.
For those of you who are listening, I'm describing this on the video. We'll put it up on YouTube so you can actually see it, but those are just composite signals.
I'm going to reach over here and unplug something real quick so I can show something on the stream too. Now, if you're one of the cool kids, you might have one of these.
Hey, yo. AV.
So this is the AV Famicom. So the original Famicom also only outputted RF. But this one was kind of really late in the Famicom's life. And they decided to get a little experimental. And you might be able to see on the back here. So they actually put in a multi-out like the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, and the GameCube would have later.
Was the Super Nintendo out when that came out? Is that one of the reasons they had that port at that point?
It must have been.
Okay.
I have to imagine. The other difference you'll notice is that this is flat on the top, whereas the American one is curved. That's because this one had to support the Famicom Disk System RAM adapter.
And for those of you in the States who aren't quite familiar, this is what, the Famicom cart compared to a Nintendo cart. Yeah, there you go. Oh, perfect. Got an EverDrive too. So you can see the differences.
Oh, I didn't know you had a copy of One Paku Graffiti.
I'm trying to own a copy of everything I speedrun, so
that's not a bad idea. You never know when a flash card's going to wig out on you. Yep. I have the reverse adapter here somewhere that takes the big giant NES games and puts them on here. But
so the video straight from the Nintendo or the Famicom might work on a modern TV. It's not a guaranteed thing that it'll actually work and actually be something usable.
Yeah, the composite video should.
Oh, composite. Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
The RF, it should if your TV has a screw adapter. If it doesn't, then you deal with it. That said, if all you want to do is get it on the TV, you can definitely get composite HDMI adapters. If I had thought about it, I would have one out. I have one in the drawer over there. They're like $20, $15. They're not great. But
they work.
They work. The one big thing you'll notice with them is that they treat 240p, which is how the Nintendo generates its video signal, as 480i, because it's assuming that you're passing it like an old VCR or something like that. And for the most part, you won't notice a big difference, but the one thing you'll notice is anytime your character flashes, like if you get damaged and you flash to show that you're invincible, it will either decide to look at one field and then your character will disappear, or it will look at the other field and your character won't flash at all.
Wow. Kind of heavy.
Yeah, it's just a weird quirk of how they handle it. But if all you want to do is play Mario on the TV, it's going to work just fine. That said, there's a lot more you can do to them.
I think it's important that one of the things I haven't tried out, and I'm hoping, I'm actually thinking of purchasing one just so I can try it out, but is the RetroTink, which is kind of an interesting solution. If we're talking about just composite, not modifying the console at all, is that something that could be used in this situation, and what's the benefit of it?
So the RetroTink absolutely will work. It does properly receive the 240p signal over the composite. So you can totally use the RetroTink 2X. Don't use you won't be able to use any of the new RAD 2X cables. They just don't have one for the NES yet, but we'll talk about those later. Okay. But you can use the RetroTink 2X, which is about $100. And what it does is it takes either composite S-video or component video and outputs a 480p HDMI signal. And the 480p HDMI signal, almost every modern TV will handle that without any problems.
And from my understanding, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't add any lag. It's a zero added lag solution. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think by definition it's a few microseconds, which if you are going to come tell me that microseconds are detectable as lag, I have some beachfront property in Texas. That doesn't make sense. There is beaches.
There are beaches on both sides of Texas, but
yes,
I know what you're saying.
Property in Kansas. How about that?
There you go. Okay, cool. So I think that that's a really good starting place to, if one of the things that Evan and I have done this kind of version of this chat a couple of different times now at SGDQs and other times, and the important thing I think to take away from this is that if you just want to get up and going, you can do so with very little added expense.
Yeah.
Use the stuff that you have available to you to try getting this stuff going at first. In fact, there are many streamers who speed run and submit to leaderboards. They just use the composite and capture the composite signal.
Yeah, one of the things I really want to emphasize to people is it is possible that you will go to this retro store, buy a Nintendo, come home, plug in the same games you played as a kid, and decide you really don't like it. It sounds weird, and it's not one of those like nostalgia glasses kind of thing. It's the thing that you may find that you don't like is that, or I guess it would be nostalgia. When we were kids, we only had the 5 or 6 games that we had. You know, maybe you rented a game now and then, but we didn't have 60, 80, $100 in some cases I've seen for new games back on the Nintendo. We didn't have that money, so we were reliant on our parents. And so we got a game at, you know, Christmas or Hanukkah. We got a game at our birthday, and that was it. So a lot of times we put a lot of mental, I'm trying to think of the word, we built a game up because it was the only games we had.
Right.
We thought they were great, but we look back at them now and they're not that great. There are some classics, of course. Super
Absolutely.
Mario Brothers are always good. Mega Mans are always good. But I think one of the big ones that you see a lot, and it wavers how good people consider that game, is the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game.
Great example.
I know the angry video game nerd has railed against it. Some other people say it's just a fine game. It's just really hard. But when I was a kid, that game was awesome. You got to play as the Ninja Turtles.
Right. It was the greatest thing ever. Who cared if it was harder than hell? At least it seemed like it was. Good point. Great point. And I think that's, you know, one of the reasons probably why I ended up, you know, with a CRT TV, because I was trying to replicate that nostalgia feeling. But to your point, there's going to be no way of getting that feel when you're 8 years or 10 years old playing a game for the first time back in the 90s. There's just it's going to be nearly impossible. So it's a good point. You got to manage your expectations when you're going to start doing some of this stuff.
Yeah. So if you spend $100 or $200 getting this so that it's the best,
yes,
and then you decide you don't like it, that's $200 you could have spent on a modern console if that's better for you.
Absolutely. Okay, so cool. So there's the very basics, get you in the door. That's how you're going to get your Nintendo on your TV. There's let's start off with some very basic modifications you can do. I've already opened up my console, and this is the only console I own that Evan actually hasn't worked on. And when I first I sent it away to a professional, quote unquote professional, to get some modifications done. The first thing they did was replace my 72 pin connector, which let's see if I can actually show it in here. Hey, there you can kind of see it in there. Why would I want to do that? What does that do? Tell me a little bit about the 72 pin connector on the Nintendo.
So in Japan, the games plug directly into the top. But in America, we had just gone through a video game crash just a couple years before the Nintendo came out. And so Nintendo decided it can't look like a video game console. So you can't just plug the game in the top of it like you did with your Atari 2600. People are going to hate it and dismiss it. No one wants video games. So what we need to do is we need to make it look like a VCR. And that's why we got this style. So the way it works is you put your game in to the you can leave the top off that. But you put your game in, and then when you push it down, you're actually pushing the pins of the game down against the 72 pin connector in a kind of a spring-loaded fashion. The problem is those spring-loaded pins, they wear out over time, and eventually they actually will just not properly connect, and your games won't load. And there's all kinds of solutions for it. You can take it out of there and boil it in a pot, supposedly fixes it. Um, I've
Sounds
never done
apocryphal.
that. Uh, you can get in there with like a tool like this. This is what they call a spudger, and you can kind of pry them up. Um, the other thing you can do is just buy a brand new one because there's so many Nintendos and this is such a popular system. There's like one factory in China that produces thousands a day, and they're all up on eBay, $5 a piece. You can buy them in lots of 10 if you're somebody that fixes Nintendos all the time. The other thing you can do that I highly recommend, and it's a basically a guaranteed fix for most of the issues you might have with a Nintendo, is get what's called a blinking light win from, I think it's Arcade Works makes it, and it dramatically changes the way the Nintendo accepts games, but it removes the spring-loaded action. You literally just slide the game in and you give it a good shove, and it goes into a cartridge connection. It will hold on to it for dear life. It takes some good grip to get it back out of there, but it fixes your games will work, and it also fixes issues that sometimes happens with the copyright protection lockout chip. Uh, so that also might be an issue that you have. If you've ever put your game in, push it down, press power, and then the light blinks, hence the blinking light win name. That's usually not that the game isn't being read, it's that, or not read properly, it's that the game can't make a connection to the copy protection chip, the Playten chip or whatever.
So on my console, the way it currently is configured, I actually don't have to engage the spring. It'll just play right when I pop the card in. I don't know if they made that modification you're referring to. I know that I don't.
That's a new design. I haven't seen that.
Oh, cool. So. It works great. And depending on, but the nice thing is, and is that something that you can do on your own? Like what's the difficulty level of replacing a 72 pin connector or, you know?
As long as you're not someone that loses screws, it's 100% user replaceable. It attaches with a card edge connector to the main board.
Oh, cool.
So you actually just can peel it right off the board and then slide the new one on.
Are there any other like maintenance-y type modifications that one might want to consider for a Nintendo, as it's you know, it's a console now that's 30 years old. You know, it's not a young spring chicken anymore.
Just maintenance? Not really.
Okay.
You might want to open yours up and just verify that there's no water damage in it.
I know I've seen some things too where people play with the light or, you know, things like that, like, you know, indicator light, fun stuff like that.
That's not a maintenance
No,
thing.
Absolutely not.
So, yeah, you can change the LED color out if you want. One thing you might consider doing is putting a little either rubbing alcohol or better yet deoxit on a paper towel and cleaning the contacts on the video out. That may improve connection issues if you're getting noise.
The actual contacts themselves are the one. Okay,
yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, what you can do if you really want to, if you have a set of, because composite video cables are a dime a dozen, just you can dip the entire head of a composite cable in some deoxit or some rubbing alcohol and go on it, twist it around, pull it back off, go back on it, twist it around, and that'll break up a lot of corrosion or whatever. Because I can actually look at yours and see that there's a little bit of corrosion.
Yep, I could see that just by. I mean, I never use this one, so I don't use the composite connectors anymore.
Yeah.
So. But I can totally see it around there. That's interesting.
Yeah,
it's an easy maintenance thing you to do. Okay, cool. Let's get a little. So one of the things that struck me right away was that, well, because I'm a geek and I dig this stuff, I wanted to improve the video signal like right away when I got into my Nintendo. And I believe there are. Well, first of all, what can we do to improve the video output of the Nintendo? Let's start with that.
Okay, so let's take another little history journey back. When people started to realize, so in Europe you could use RGB on a lot of consoles for a long time, but in America, when people started realizing that you could use RGB, they started looking at how to use RGB on all their consoles. Bob from Retro RGB is a good example. He says, you know, I figured out that RGB was a thing, and then I was like, how do I get this on all my consoles?
Yes, every single one.
That's how the website started. With the Nintendo, the early RGB upgrades, which is the most basic, like modern, best video quality upgrade you can do to it, were to actually take the pixel processing unit chips, the video chips out of the arcade games, the Play Choice 10 games,
Whoa.
and put them in your NES, and then you solder a bunch of wires to it, and it's the worst kind of modding because you're ruining the arcade board. Well, you're not ruining it, but you're cannibalizing an arcade board, which is even more rare for an NES, and then modifying that pixel processing unit or PPU chip, and then you're modifying your console. So now you've like destroyed two perfectly good electronics to make one that won't even look like what you remember as a kid, because the color palette on the Play Choice 10 was different.
Oh, geez. Okay.
So, Mario, instead of being blue and red, was brown and red.
Is that not the original colors of Mario? No,
so it's, yeah. So from there, they started doing some more experimentation. And I don't know the exact history, but if we jump ahead to where we're at now, there's a guy in Australia named Tim Worthington, and he designed, I think along with somebody else, but he designed a upgrade board that uses a small FPGA, and it actually interfaces with the pixel processing unit and outputs RGB from that board. It actually outputs composite video, S video, and RGB.
This isn't the board. This is actually the voltage regulator, but we'll get into it just a little bit. I just realized what that is. But
wait, why do you have a voltage regulator attached to the side of it?
Well, there's a switch underneath, so we'll get into.
Oh, so they put, so where the voltage regulator would have been on the board, they put in a switch.
Yes.
Before we went on the air with this interview, I was commenting that there's a lot of wires in the installation. I wish I could open up my EverDrive and show you my installation. There are not near that many wires in there. That's okay. So they had to move the voltage regulator away, which means that they're now at, okay. We'll critique that later.
Let's get to this point. So, if we wanted to, let's go from. So we already know how to get composite out. If we wanted to get S video out, could we? And why would we choose S video? Let's start with that.
You can't get S video out by default, just because the pixel processing unit doesn't handle it. The Nintendo actually generates its video signal as composite.
Okay.
It does not output RGB from the pixel processing unit by default, and it does not output luminance and chrominance, which is what makes up S video, by default. So that's not a mod you can go directly to. Now, other consoles, S video is absolutely something you can do. S video is output on the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, and the GameCube.
Okay.
And it's going to be a big upgrade. If you can get to S video, you might notice that you don't really need an RGB connection.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I've seen,
this video is much higher quality, and just separating the signals, the luminance and chrominance signals, makes a huge difference.
For a quick example of that, I know Supersonic is a speedrunner who I think it's his NES. I can't remember which one, but one of his is an S video, and he captures it that way, and it looks really good. Like, it's a big upgrade from the composite. You'll notice right away.
Yeah.
So there is, and depending on your setup, S video may be the best choice for you. One of the things that you're going to run into is, what do you have? What do you want to make work? So, I will say, I can go down my line a little, is that for me, going component with everything was going to be the easiest choice. When I first started getting consoles, which was about 2 years ago, HD Retrovision had just come out with cables that made it possible to grab the RGB signal and output in component. it looks like everyone wants to say something about that. So I'm gonna let.
Oh no, I was just going to comment. Yeah, in Europe they used these guys,
There you go.
Art Connection, and in the United States we didn't have true RGB. What we had was YPBPR, which is luminance, and then it's a different standard. It's not just direct red, green, and blue. It's subtractive video, and but anyway, it output essentially picture compatible, like with RGB. The two will output nearly identical images, and in the late 90s and early 2000s, almost every CRT that came out started coming out with component video. And the big reason for that was because the DVD players that were coming out were coming with component video. And so it was a way to get a better signal from your DVD player.
So that brings up a good question. You know, if I'm going to take the dive into RGB, why would I choose SCART versus component? Or RGB, I'm sorry.
There's not a good answer to that. SCART cables tend to be a little cheaper.
Okay. Regional, would that have any sort of impact or influence if I'm, in Europe?
For sure.
Okay.
If you live in Europe, it's almost assuredly easy to get old CRTs that have a SCART RGB input on them. But the big reason that they're cheaper is that there's no circuitry that's necessary, at least no active component circuitry that's necessary to convert it from the console. The console outputs, at least the consoles that output RGB, output R, G, and B, and a sync signal, which is what is on some of these pins. If you're with component video, the console is outputting RGB, that has to be converted. And so there's actually chips in there. That's what HD Retrovision, that's the big, I mean, they use really good cables. That was a big thing, but the big innovation they had was that they were creating the circuit to convert from RGB properly to component video.
Very cool. And I think that's it. To say the least, we're living in a great time where it seems like a month doesn't go by and there's not some sort of new or innovation in the space of all this stuff. So let's get to the mod. So I've decided I'm going to take a plunge. I'd like to get the RGB signal out of my NES. What does that mean? What do I have to do? Is it possible that I can do it myself? I know there's like 8,000 questions, but let's start with is it something, first of all, I could take on my own? Could I try to do this on my own?
If you are an experienced solderer, yes. Okay. But I don't recommend it.
Okay.
And I'm not someone that sells my modding services, mainly because I don't want to be responsible for someone else's property.
Thank you. I appreciate that, by the way.
Yeah. Like with Matt's stuff, I feel comfortable that if I screw something up, I will replace it for him. I don't want to screw something up and have to replace 10 Nintendos or whatever. I recommend it just because a professional modder is going to do a better job. It is going to be very reliable.
Plus, you have some recourse. There's a little bit of
yes.
If you're working with a professional, oftentimes, in fact, this one, I got a warranty with my modification with this one. That's the one thing I will say is that I got a warranty with it. It only lasted a year, or it was 90 days, but it's glad that I had one. As we were saying earlier, looking at this mod, this would be probably someone that's early to the modification. Actually, you know what? Now that I look around this, it's not that bad. Those cables in the bottom corner, I thought might be weird video cables. They're not. They're the controller connection cables. I'm kind of dumb here. I would also say, Evan, I do want to preface this, is that I was given the option of where to put some of these things. He actually sent me photos along the way, and not knowing what I was getting into, I probably should have called you at this point and asked, hey, where's the best place for this? This is one of the options. So I chose this. So
I will say this is indicative of a much older mod.
Yeah.
Nowadays, what you see a lot of times is they'll actually remove the RF uh, adapter section, the you can see the capacitor in the upper right hand corner of the that's the RF area. Um, they'll remove that portion of the board and replace that with a 3D printed and a circuit board multi-out. And so you can use your Super Nintendo cables just like anybody else.
That's awesome.
That's kind of the modern way to do that.
That would have been nice. I wish I had that option. That would have been awesome.
Yeah, it does require cutting the console, which is some people don't like. I'm not a big fan of it. That said, I don't think that this mod is going to be obsolete in a few years, so cutting it's not that big of a deal.
So there is, you mentioned soldering because of the connections you're going to have to make, but there is, I mean, there's you have to walk me through because I'm going to get the terminology wrong, but there's a little board that comes with the RGB mod. Is that correct? Or a little chip thing?
So the board's maybe the size of a business card.
Okay.
And it has all the circuitry necessary for the RGB on it. What you then have to do is you have to assemble the interposer. It's not even an interposer, I guess. It's the way it works is you actually remove so that's the hard part, is actually removing the pixel processing unit. I have a desoldering gun, and that made it super quick and easy when I do it. But if you have to do it by hand, it may take you a while. But you have to remove all the solder off the 40 pins of the pixel processing unit and pull it out of the console.
Wow.
And then attach a set of pin headers. You attach a socket, then a set of pin headers, and then another socket onto the RGB board, and then you put the pixel processing on. So basically, it's going to the RGB board sits in between the pixel processing unit. So yeah, it is an interposer, and the console itself.
Got it. Okay. So just hearing you talk through it, it's not something that's it's not a basic type of thing. There's definitely some things that make this intricate and detailed.
And there are mods out there for other consoles. I would absolutely say can be done by an average person. The N64 RGB mod, if you have one of the early N64s, that is easy to do. That one is easy. And if you have any decent soldering skill, it's something you can do.
So I'm hoping that we could cover some of the other consoles in later episodes because Evan did do the N64 RGB mod for me. And I think that it's, to your point, I remember watching you stream it, and it was something that, even though I don't have any soldering skills, it looks like if I developed some soldering skills, it's something I could take on that I could actually be done.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
What I was going to say is, once you've gotten all of that done, I've heard mentioned quite often that once you have it open, why not consider recapping, quote unquote, your NES? What is recapping? What does that do? What are the benefits? And is that something you should do?
I did it to mine.
Okay.
So what Matt's talking about here is that you could, there are capacitors, and a good example is that big one that you can see in the corner there. Yeah, that one that
missing it there.
Yeah.
Video, little
that one that you're tapping. Yeah, so that's the power filter capacitor specifically. But there's on the NES there's about 7 or 8 of them, I think. It's not a lot.
Oh, okay.
But those do go bad over time. Luckily, the NES was made at a time when they were still using good ones. In the early 90s, somebody came up with a cheaper way of making capacitors, and everybody switched to that because, if you save 12 cents on 10 million or 100 million units, that's a lot of money you save. And those started leaking eventually or blowing up, and it's a big mess. It destroys electronics. They do age though, and your NES is nearing 35 years old, and
Jeez. That doesn't make me feel any younger.
Yeah. So it may be worth it, and any good modder that you find out there will offer that as a service. It probably won't be too expensive. It may be a $20 or $30 add-on. I would suggest going ahead and getting it done, as long as they promise you that they're going to use good capacitors. There's some, I could name off some brands, but there's 100 brands of capacitors. But Nichicon, Panasonic, those are good capacitors. As long as they're going to use good ones, it's worth it, if only because it means that your console is going to last you another 30, 35 years. It'll last you till you can pass it on to your great-grandchildren.
And I mean, that's the idea here. We're trying to preserve these consoles so that we can continue playing them. I have heard that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the capacitor replacement on any console is that's a good starting project. If you want to try something yourself, that's something like you could actually take on yourself.
Yeah, I would do it on something like a Nintendo, rather than maybe a TurboGrafx or a Core Graphics. When I did your Core Graphics, it has like 30 capacitors.
Oh my god, I didn't realize it was that many. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, and they're all really close. A lot of them are really close together. So
it was a project.
Yeah, it was a project. I ended up spending a couple hours doing it.
Good.
Yeah, the really nice thing is, if you go to Console 5, they've put together capacitor kits.
Oh, cool.
And so they'll send you all the capacitors you need. They're all good brands. And they, on their website, they have a wiki that has capacitor listings for all the versions of the consoles. So you can desolder all the capacitors out, pull them all out, and then go back and install them, and you'll actually have a listing that says C6 is this type of capacitor and C8 is this type of capacitor. Which otherwise, if you didn't already have that list, you would actually have to, one at a time, remove the capacitor, install the new one. And that becomes really annoying because it's easy sometimes to lose track of which ones you've installed and which one.
Okay. Good call. Thank you so much for that info. That's I think it's really helpful. And I think it's, especially as we get to other consoles where we'll talk about how it impacts the video signal. It seems like Nintendo, that's one of the areas they actually, it seems like it was done pretty well on the original NES console. So I don't hear as much of an uproar as I do about some of the other consoles where it becomes a much more significant issue. Okay, so we've opened up our Nintendo. Let's say we've done the capacitor, we've done our 72 pin, we've done our RGB, we've done all these kind of things that we could do. You mentioned that we could drill some holes. Let's say we did the multi out with our RGB mod. We could modify it here. On mine, excuse me,
it would actually be on the back side,
correct,
where the R is. So
I was able to, the board modification at the time created this sort of output, which is this is how I got my component signals out, and that's or RGB out, I should say, red, green, blue, and you just pop that guy in there, and then you can send it out to your component. It's not RGB?
No, it's component. It's YPBPR. So the green is Y, the blue is PB, and the red is PR.
Dude, thank you for correcting me. I've been curious. I know I'm screwing it up when I say it, so educational for myself as well. So
hold on.
Yeah, no problem. I will. So one of the things, depending on your setup, I will say that it will work if I take component cables from here and I plug it into a modern TV that has a component input. It'll work right away. Depending on the TV, and in fact, I've even noticed I have two different TVs. I have a Vizio and a Samsung. On the Samsung, I can get almost a close to CRT experience. Not exactly, but close. And with the Vizio, it's real. There's a lot of lag just going component straight in.
Yeah.
And what you got?
I was going to show you. So this looks familiar to you, I'm sure.
Hey, there you go.
So this is a good example of, this actually has they're in weird order, but RG and B outputs. And those are actually RGB. So it's not easy, or it's very easy to be confused. And they didn't make it easy by using the same types of colors for component video that they did for RGB.
Oh, good to know. For reference, Evan was showing the RGB or the RGB output from a TurboGrafx 16 or a PC Engine card. So.
Yeah, the little mod board.
Okay, cool. One of the things that I learned right away is that it looks good when I put that on stream, but all that I'm getting out from this is 240p, or as depending on the way your TV interprets, like you were saying, Evan, sometimes you might actually see a 480i display. So if we wanted to capture that at the highest possible quality, let's say we're, I want to put it on the stream. I want it to look as good as possible. One of the areas I found right away was that you could get into scaling, and we won't spend too much time. We could probably do a whole episode just on scalers, but this is the one that I use, and that is I would say pretty common nowadays. This is the OSSC.
Yeah.
And what I can do here is I can go directly from here into the OSSC, and it outputs in HDMI. And it's simply, I mean, Evan, you could speak. What is it? It's a line doubler, right? It doubles the resolution.
Yes. So we talked about the RetroTink 2X earlier. That's a true line doubler. It does literally doubles lines. The OSSC is a little bit more expensive. It's about twice as much, but it is much more versatile. It will take in almost any video signal you can give it, including, you'll notice on it that it has a SCART connection, a component video connection, and a VGA connection. It will take nearly any resolution you give it, and it will output a HDMI signal. Now, the HDMI signal, because it's not doing it doesn't have what's called a frame buffer, so it's not loading a whole picture into the frame buffer and then outputting it over HDMI. It's doing line by line. That's what makes it fast and makes it so that there's no lag, but it also makes it so that the HDMI output is not always compatible with every TV and is not always compatible in every mode, because it actually offers a line 2x, a line 3x, a line 4x, and a line 5x mode. The line 5x mode is like what's 240 times 5?
I know it's some weird resolution that I can't remember the name.
No, it's because 4x is 960p, so it's 1200p.
That's right. There you
go. Which no consumer TV is going to support, although modern 4K TVs might.
And rarely, I mean, people will, but there's not a lot of people capturing in that resolution for streaming, or just for video online or whatever.
Yeah, you'd have to have a 4K capture device, and those are, while they exist, and they're just really expensive right now.
Opponent in the chat saying he has a RetroTink 2X, which is awesome. I'm curious, do you use it for streaming, Opponent? I want to ask, because I've seen Opponent stream, and it actually looks really, it's got a really nice capture on it for his retro consoles.
Yeah, if you go back and look at our panel we did at SGDQ this summer, we all talked about the RetroTink, and I brought up specifically the reason I really like the RetroTink 2X is that you can get an HDMI capture device that supports 480p for probably $20 on eBay. Good ones, Elgato, and combine it with a RetroTink, and you can stream.
Right.
It'll work perfectly. I would get an HDMI splitter. Those you can get on Amazon. If all you're looking to do is split HDMI, they work great. If you're looking to do some processing on the video signal, let's say, you need specific models of splitters, but you can always ask me about that later.
An opponent mentions that he uses it for S-video capture, the RetroTink, which is that's actually a really good use case of it. We were talking about S-video earlier, but once again, if you take a look at opponent's stream, the video quality is quite good, and he was saying that he's run into some accepting some of the analog signal. So once you start getting into the capture part of this and the streaming part of this, you'll notice that not everything works well with each other. I just have an Elgato game capture, and it handled the 240p and the 480i fine. Everything else, it would refuse to capture it. So like when I tried 3xing and 4xing, that's when I hit walls with my Elgato, which I thought was kind of interesting.
The other thing you'll notice with the Elgato is if you try to use component video, it doesn't accept 240p over component.
Oh, really? Interesting. Okay, I don't even remember that happening.
It'll accept it over composite, but not over component. And that's something we ran into on another streamer's
Right.
setup that we were trying to mess with. If you want to be a really madman, you can combine a RetroTink 2X and a OSSC into one device or one composite device by converting the HDMI out from the RetroTink to VGA and then feeding that into the OSSC. And what that provides you with, you might think, well, why would you need to do that? That provides you with a composite and an S-video input into your OSSC.
And I will say that this is a great time to we did SGDQ 2019. We had a hardware panel with myself, Evan, Tina Hacks, and Duango AC, the TaskBot guy, and we get into this stuff real geek, and it's we go down the rabbit hole, and I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. But I would also say that I'm going to include it in the feed at some point here on the podcast, so you will get a chance to hear it. But it really goes down the rabbit hole because. Like another thing Evan, a long time ago when I first started, recommended the DataPath Vision cards, and they accept almost anything I've ever thrown at it, including right now it's capturing the video. Like I'm putting an HD camera through it. It accepts every type of retro console I put through it. Like it's just a beast.
Yeah, it has really, I don't even want to say loose. It will accept literally any video timing you pass.
Exactly.
So it will accept up to 1080p and up to 60 frames per second without a hiccup. The one thing you'll notice is if you start capturing, you may start seeing things on your computer that you never saw on your CRT or even maybe on your home TV because it captures everything.
And I will say too that a lot of times you can find them used on eBay for under $100 US. Most of the time you'll see them around 130, but I have bought two now, and both of them have been under $100. And I bought one recently, as 3 months ago, that was under $100.
Yeah.
So, this is a good question. Opponent asks, would you happen to know if the OSSC accepts 55 hertz signals from arcade boards? I believe the answer is yes, but Evan looks like he has an answer.
It probably does. The one thing to be wary of is that it does not accept what's known as TTL level sync, which is what an arcade board would output. So you need some sort of device that attenuates the sync in between. If you have a super gun, that would a properly built super gun would do that. And if you're not sure, if you've never heard of a super gun, it's just a device that basically allows you to take an arcade board and interface it with video out and the controller inputs. So you can run an arcade board on your TV at home.
So these, that's actually some really good questions. And maybe we'll just do an episode just on scalers and things like that, because I know a lot of us who are into the retro thing love getting the best quality video we can out of it. So I know it's something I still am striding for today. Basically, on the retro consoles, I want to RGB mod every single one of them. I want to get so it's a great topic of conversation. I want to move forward just a little bit here. And so Evan, if I'm a speedrunner, I want to submit to the leaderboard. I want to have a properly judged speedrun. If I modify my console, does that affect the way that a speedrun might be judged or that is looked at, or how does that affect that part of it?
It depends on the modification.
Okay.
So we can start at the ones that clearly won't affect it at all, which is like changing out the LED lights and that kind of stuff. That won't affect it at all. RGB modding shouldn't affect it. If you mod, so that the Nintendo, one of the options for a mod is a HDMI. It's called the high def NES. Mod, and you can actually mod it to output HDMI instead of RGB. I believe that outputs a proper HDMI signal, which may be faster or slower than the NES naturally outputs. It shouldn't make a difference for speedrunning. The video may be a little weird in that you might see some tearing or that kind of thing. But it shouldn't affect it. There are situations where mods could affect it. A good example is the new Game Boy advanced consolizer,
Hmm.
in order to output the video at an HDMI compatible signal, I believe they actually had to speed it up slightly.
Oh, interesting.
And so, in speeding it up slightly, um, it made it so that now your console is running, or your Game Boy Advance is running faster, so your times wouldn't be valid. Um, Somebody will probably correct me on this in YouTube comments later, and I welcome.
Please. That's how we learn.
Yeah, but I believe that they've announced that there's going to be a speedrunner mode if in the firmware, if not in the current firmware, or it's going to be added in a future firmware that would run it at its native speed, but the HDMI may not be compatible with all displays. That's the trade-off.
And the cardinal rule for all of this is check the rules of the leaderboard before you submit a run. And
Yes.
then I would also say that if you're just wanting to get started, these type of things play very little. If you just want to get started with speedrunning, don't let these be the barrier to get you, learning the skills and the techniques you need to play the game well.
Yeah, in our panel with Lack Attack a couple years ago, one of the things we talked about was that a lot of the games that are out there that can be speedrun are don't require proper console verification until you get into the like top 5 or 10% of
Right.
times.
Mm-hmm.
Just because they would rather have people putting in times that are not exactly kosher, but are playing the game, than to demand that everyone go out and buy a real copy of a $500, $1,000 NES game in some cases, depending on what you're doing. They'd much rather have you try it and get a time on there. And then when we talk about world records, then we'll talk about like it needing to be on official console with an official.
And just to be perfectly honest with you, we talked about this, like you said, with during the panel with Lack, is that that's going to be important for the most competitive games at the highest level. So we're talking about your Marios, Zeldas, Metroids, Mega Mans at the top 10 times, So
Yeah.
my dog is dreaming. I don't know if you just heard him in the background, but okay, cool. So I think the cardinal rule there is just always check the leaderboard and check the rules before you submit. As we start to wrap this thing up, what are some good resources? Where should I be looking if I'm into any of this? What are some good places to get some good info?
If you're interested in the whole RGB thing, retrorgb.com, that has become not only a repository for all the knowledge we have about this stuff, or at least most of the knowledge. Pardon me. It has also become a news site for how retro gaming is changing. There's new articles on all the new things. There's new articles, and they cover everything from just, hey, this new homebrew game, to anytime there's a Mr. Core release, there's a news article about it.
And I want to add on that the guy who runs it is an enthusiast, and he is learning just as much as we all are as we're going through it.
Yeah.
He's by trade, he's not a hardware engineer or anything like that. So you get a really good understanding of everything that gets posted, but also he's covering it this is his day job nowadays. And Bob runs a podcast. It's really awesome. I highly recommend Retro RGB. That's actually where I hired my modder for my NES.
Okay. Yeah, if you got one that was recommended from there, then I will assume that the work done. I will no longer cast aspersions to the work that was done.
Fair enough.
I was quick to jump and say, "Oh, that looks terrible," but
anytime really you see wires, though, I'm the same way. You get concerned, like, huh?
Yeah. If you're interested in doing the modding portion, Voltar's videos on YouTube are really good, and he does a good job of really casually telling you how bad this previous modder had done work without being a jerk about it.
Slight disclaimer: some of his videos are NSFW, so they're not. Don't watch him at work. So just beware on that side of things.
Yeah.
But his work's amazing. He's incredible.
Visual, it's just his language.
Right.
Choice. I'm trying to think of what else I would look at. Those two sources are really good. If you get deep down the rabbit hole, both of those guys are on a podcast called the Retro Roundtable, and they go deep into like electrical engineering and stuff like that. And I don't recommend, I recommend it as a podcast. I don't recommend you know what the hell you're listening to, because they're 2 or 3 hours long.
Yeah.
And they will talk about, you know, like signal attenuation and stuff like that you probably don't need to listen to. Beware of the YouTubers out there. That's the one thing I'll pass on. And I don't want to, I'm literally not going to name it in this case.
There's been some drama the last few weeks on the Twitters, so I know what you're but
just be aware that some YouTubers don't know what they're talking about, and or receive products for free and give good reviews willy-nilly. They don't properly criticize products. And when I say criticize, I mean both in good and way.
Critical. You're critical thinking of the
yes. Yeah, they're not using critical thinking. They're just saying, well, this person paid me, or this person gave me this free product. I want to continue to get free products in the future, so I'm going to say it's a great thing. And that means that their 1 million+ followers or subscribers, some of them are going to go out and buy the product and go, this is terrible. Why did I buy this?
And I think that's
they're not going to get a refund, and that's not going to change that YouTuber's mind.
And this brings up another good point, and that's, you don't have to don't do some research when you're going down this rabbit hole. I know one of the things that I struggled with when I first when I first got into this was I didn't want to bother a streamer while they were doing a stream, asking them what their setup was and how they did it. So for speedrunners, it's challenging sometimes to take on some of these questions as we're streaming. So if you can, get involved in a Discord community, and that's a great place to ask questions. Twitter is another one. I hate to bombard Retro Bob, but like Bob responds to almost any comment you send him, so he's a great resource, and his web Retro RGB is. But to Evan's point, if you see something that looks cool, don't
tweet at Bob.
Don't tweet at Bob.
No.
Don't do
it. Not that he's not a great resource. Don't give him 800 million more tweets to deal with. You can tweet at me, and
there you go.
And you can tweet at whoever. You can tweet at Bob if you want, but I'm not encouraging people to go out there and give him a bunch more traffic. Follow him.
There you go. Yeah. He'll post enough to, it's a good resource. Yeah. That's a good point.
But don't bombard him with tweets.
That's a very good point.
The other bit I wanted to mention is, this is another one of those soapbox kind of things, is if you go to eBay to buy a modded console, do not, and I mean 100% of the time, do not buy a modded console that does not have pictures of the console open.
Ooh, good
in the eBay listing. Because you have no idea what the actual mod quality is until you get it home, and you likely will have trouble getting a refund from there. So
I would also say that's actually, Voltar's a great example of that. He's posted videos of consoles he's worked on that he purchased off of eBay specifically because of how bad they were.
Yeah. So and it's funny because one of the early videos that Voltar did was there was a Japanese modder, Doujin Dance or something, that basically, and Voltar did like 6 videos in a row fixing his terrible mod work.
Right.
And now if you go on eBay, he has pictures of all his mod work. He has properly designed circuit boards for his mods rather than just a bunch of wires.
Yeah.
He actively wanted to get better, and he made a difference. Now, again, make sure there's a picture, but he's not someone I would steer someone away from anymore.
That's awesome. That is so cool that and that's, I think that highlights a great point about how the community, but also that the technology, and there's a ton of innovations happening on a daily basis. You can find a qualified modifier nowadays, person who will modify your consoles.
Yeah. And just remember, when we criticize people, it's not because we want them to stop doing what we want them to stop doing specifically what they're doing. We don't want them to stop their love of video games
No.
or stop modding consoles. We just want them to do it the right way.
And that makes it better for us all. Because a lot of times too, when you're going to eBay, you don't have all this knowledge, and that's kind of the idea of a podcast like this, is that you hopefully can get a better understanding, so you know what you're looking for. Evan, speaking of the tweetings, actually, before I get to that, I just wanted to say a personal thank you to Evan, because I honestly had absolutely no knowledge of what I was doing. And I still, as you can tell, I'm still learning. I don't have the best grasp of all of this stuff. Evan and I should say, Evan was the first person to judge one of my my TurboGrafx 16 speed runs on Bonk's Revenge, and that's how I met him. And so the knowledge and the work that he's done for everything I've done, I'm so ever thankful for you. If you want to see Evan talk about video games, check out SGDQ 2018 Bonk's Revenge run at SGDQ, and you can hear his video game commentary because it's great. Good.
Yeah, my wife actually asked me the other day, how did you meet Matt? And I told her that story. I said, well, he submitted a Bonk's Revenge time, and I was the mod for the game. So I watched it, and I added him on Twitch, and then I went and saw him on Twitch, and we started talking, and then I was like, hey, you should submit this for SGDQ. And if you do, I'll come be on the couch. And so you submitted, and got it. And so I came and was on the couch. And the story I always like to tell, and I'm going to embarrass Matt here,
please,
is I show up with a air mattress, and the room is a king size bed and about a foot around the king size bed. So there is nowhere to put an air mattress. So I have met Matt this morning, or this afternoon, and that night we were bedmates.
We were sleeping in the same bed within 24 hours of knowing each other.
And this last year we were like, oh, we got a suite. It's got a king bed and a pull-out couch, and we pull the pull-out couch, and it is the least comfortable thing ever.
It's like there's a broomstick handle in the back of your, in your lower back. It was not comfortable.
Shared a king-size bed again. I think next year we just need to forego any pretense and just get a room with king bed and be done with it.
Right. Why even bother? What the heck?
No, if we can get 2 queens, that'd be great. But
well, it highlights what I love about this community, and what I love about speedrunning and retro and everything is that 2 years ago I didn't know Evan existed, and now I would consider him a very good friend because of all the things that we share an affinity for the same thing. Evan, if somebody would like to hit you up with some questions, or just in general get to know you, where'd be a good place to find you?
The easiest place is on Twitter.
And what is your Twitter handle?
My Twitter handle is EvanGrill, just like you see it on the screen there. If you're listening to the audio podcast, it's at EvanGrill.
And I do have to say that one of the selfish reasons I wanted to do this episode with Evan is because I'd love him to stream some more console mods and more hardware stuff. I know he's probably looking for you probably want to get on with your career in real life, but I really loved that kind of content that you were creating.
Yeah. The big thing I have to do is just clean up. I need more storage space. My workbench has gotten to the point that it's kind of a mess. Hopefully, I just bought the parts to build a bench power supply. So once I get that built, I might be able to put some of this stuff on top of that. And so I might have a little bit more room, but I need some sort of cabinet in here to put stuff in. It doesn't help that I have a 27-inch iMac sitting on my workbench right now. It's really nice because I can pull up, if I'm doing mod work or something, I can pull up a schematic, I can pull up an instruction guide right on the screen, I can see my Twitch chat, but it's also eats like a third of the table.
Well, Evan, thank you so much for doing this, and thanks for your time. I appreciate all the info and the knowledge. Anytime.